Okay.
Sure. Hello, Jason.
Hi.
Okay, so Jason Ross from the scientific group of the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Yeah, I mean, know what you say. So let's just listen to what Jason has to say. Oh,
You can hear me now, right?
yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I would have. It's a shame I didn't get to hear the discussion so far. So hopefully this isn't too repetitive or divergent. What I wanted to talk to you guys about today and discuss was the concept of what the identity of the human species is and why that question is important and, in fact, essential for solving the specific problems that confront us. In particular, I wanted to talk about the crisis of water, which has been a very important issue for us here at LaRouche PAC over the past weeks, months, years, decades, actually. This comes because, in particular, the California situation is very dramatic. As I suspect you've heard from news reports, the state of California currently has a very intense water crisis where reservoirs are drying up, rain is not falling, snow is not falling. The ability to get water from the ground, groundwater, is diminishing. Wells have to be dug deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper to get at the water. Millions of acres are not being planted. The crops will not exist. The food will not be made. And the response to all of this has been the governor calling for a reduction of water use by 25%. Reducing water consumption will not create new sources of water. And California is a state which has already reduced per capita water consumption by about 30% over the past few decades. So what this really presents to us is the need to look at our planet and ourselves in the galaxy in which we live, and to take very seriously our unique species characteristic, being that we are not like the animals. I mean, our bodies are, but as a species, we're not biologically determined. And there's been a major fight about what the identity of the human individual is. The broadest way of addressing this dispute is between Prometheus and Zeus. These are in, for example, a story, a poem, a play by Aeschylus, who wrote 3 plays. We only have the first one remains today, and it's called Prometheus Bound. It tells the story of Prometheus, who was one of the Titans, one of the original group of gods that was overthrown by Zeus. And upon taking power, Zeus acted as a dictator and hated humanity. Zeus planned to eliminate the entire human race. Humans got on his nerves. What Prometheus did was to be a benefactor to humanity. The story you've probably heard is that Prometheus gave fire to mankind. And that's true. It's not the only thing he gave mankind. In Aeschylus's play and in the other stories, we learn that Prometheus did take fire from Zeus and give it to humanity, but he also gave us humanity. He gave, and Aeschylus describes this, Prometheus gave astronomy, navigation, construction, agriculture, the use of animals, medicine, music, mathematics, poetry, writing. So all of the things that created the human species, this is what Prometheus had done. Set us apart from the animals, made humanity distinct. Now, the Promethean outlook of humanity says, let's make that our identity. Let's use this ability to discover things, to increase our knowledge, to change our relationship to nature. Let's use that to overcome problems, to overcome the circumstances that nature has provided us with, and today this means let's go out into space, let's develop the ability to prevent asteroids from making life on the planet extinct. On the other side is Zeus, empire, oligarchy, which says that the human species should be controlled in number, kept very small, should be controlled mentally, to think small, and to be controlled politically, to have very small power for the masses over their lives, while a small oligarchy directs things. So we see this fight today between the Atlantic economies, the transatlantic system of the City of London, Wall Street, which has one approach to economy and to human beings. We see a very different approach being taken by the BRICS nations, as, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I bet G-Pay went through, so I won't say any more about that. So let's talk about how we solve problems. How would we look at California, for example? And this is a universal concept. Well, California may seem far away, but I guarantee you eat food that comes from there, and it's a universal problem. So can we conserve water to solve the crisis? No. Can we create more water by opening up to the free market more? That's what some people say. The chairman of Nestle, which is they make candy bars, but they also make a lot of bottled water. The chairman of Nestle said, look, water isn't really a human right. A little bit is, maybe 5 liters a day, but anything beyond that's not a human right, and people should pay for it. People like him say that if there was more of a profit motive in water, if water cost more, there would be more of an incentive for private industry to develop sources of water to sell on the market. That's not how the water that we do have was developed. In California, for example, the large population of the state, tens of millions, this is possible only because of large water projects that moved water from places where there was plenty into dry areas that had lots of sunshine and the potential for immense agriculture. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at water in particular from the standpoint of the galaxy, and then we'll return to the overall point about what humanity is and what it means about moving forward in other fields. So let's take a look at the, let me adjust the contrast. I know that's kind of hard to see. No, I don't think that's getting any better. That's as good as it's going to get. Okay, so what you see here is an overall chart of water on Earth. So at the bottom we have the oceans, and then we see over on the left, we see how evaporation from the sun brings water from the oceans into the atmosphere. Most of that water, 90% of the water evaporated by the sun, just falls right back into the oceans. 10% comes to fall on land. Water from land itself re-evaporates, either directly or from plants through transpiration, and falls back as rain on the continent as well. And then the last step, we have rivers, which go from the continents back into the oceans. So this is the overall cycle of water as it exists right now. And let's look at how we might affect that and what makes it happen the way that it does. So there's 3 main ways that we can intervene in this cycle. Now it's going out of focus. Let me adjust the focus here too. Sorry. Okay, that looks good. Good. Okay, so you can see these 3 aspects here. The first one is we can desalinate water from the oceans. We can do a much better job than the sun does. Using reverse osmosis and pumps, we can create fresh water using less than 0.5% of the energy that the sun uses to make fresh water. We can remove the salt from water just like we already remove pollutants and contaminants. It's harder to remove salt, but we can do it, and the energy needs are not very high. For 50 watts per person in California, 50 watts, so one light bulb, that would be enough power to power desalination along the coast for all of the water, for all of the people living in the coastal regions, for 2/3 of California's domestic, residential use. The second aspect, and that's really all there is to say about desalination. The second aspect is ionization. And this we're going to get into in the relationship of the galaxy to our climate and our weather. But it's possible through study of how clouds form and how rain falls out of them to ourselves create clouds, to create the conditions where rain falls. This is done already using cloud seeding materials such as silver iodide, which can be launched from dropped from an airplane or shot up from mortars from the ground. Ionization is another step. We'll talk more about that. And then the third step is once the rain has fallen, can we move it? For example, the northwest of our continent, BC up through Alaska, gets lots of water, and that water is not very productive. Most of it goes into the oceans without helping life, without helping participate in the biosphere or in the economy. If that water could be moved through canals and the like into the southwest part of the continent, the water could be much more productive, could participate much more in the biosphere and in the economy. So let's mostly going to focus on the ionization aspect of things and the context, the solar system and galactic context of the Earth, because believe it or not, that's essential to understand rain. So these charts may be, hopefully they're helpful. This first chart you see in red, a chart over the past decades of the amount of cosmic ray activity striking the Earth. So what is a cosmic ray? Well, there's a lot of things that come to the Earth from outside. We have sunlight from the sun. That's a very major thing that comes to the Earth from outside the planet. We have solar wind, charged particles coming out of the sun. That creates the auroras, for example, the northern lights. This is charged particles coming from the sun, interacting with the magnetic field in the atmosphere of the Earth, creating the light that you see as the auroras. We also have energetic particles that come from outside the solar system altogether, that come from other parts of the galaxy, or possibly even beyond the galaxy. So our sun, our star, Sol, the sun, it exists in the Milky Way galaxy. We are one of many stars in the galaxy. And from all these other stars, from supernovas taking place and other things that we don't yet understand, energetic particles from outside the solar system, they also come and strike the Earth. You can do experiments with this with a cloud chamber, where basically you have water vapor in a chamber, and cosmic rays come right through the atmosphere, right through buildings, and leave tracks. They're very powerful particles. Now, we're able to look back in time and get an idea about what the strength was of cosmic radiation striking the Earth. And we can go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years to do this study. The reason for this is that these cosmic rays are energetic enough to transform nitrogen in the atmosphere into the isotope carbon-14. So by studying the amount of carbon-14 that's left in tree rings, for example, in the past, we can recreate what was the cosmic ray intensity striking the Earth well before we studied it directly as we do now. So what you see here is a chart. In red is the amount of cosmic ray activity over the past few decades, where the ability to measure it is very definite. And in blue, you see the amount of low clouds. There's a very, very strong correlation between these. The reason is that cosmic radiation helps create clouds. How does it do that? Let's take a look. So this is another chart. This is one looking 8,000 years ago, again using carbon-14 to measure cosmic radiation, and using oxygen-18 as a way of measuring the amount of rainfall. This is another recreation showing the correlation between cosmic radiation and the amount of rain. I think I left out the picture I wanted. Let me grab it. Okay. Good. There we go. So what cosmic radiation does is it helps to ionize and create charged particles in the atmosphere. When you can have a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, but that does not mean that it will form a cloud. It can simply be dispersed water vapor. Clouds are formed by a process called nucleation, where larger clumps of water come together to form a cloud. Now, how does that happen? It's formed from particles like sulfur, which creates sulfuric acid, which is a very good way to create a cloud nucleus. Also, ionization. So when a particle of water vapor is struck by a cosmic ray, it loses an electron. It's now charged. Charged particles are much more likely to clump together and reach a size that makes it possible to start forming a cloud, to seed the formation of a cloud. So here you see the difference between uncharged particles versus charged particles as might be created through the ionization of a cosmic ray. Let's get back to the order of these I was going to show them in. Okay. So, okay. Here's a very helpful. Hopefully this, I see that those colors don't show up very well. This one here, the red line matches the purple one pretty well. What we're seeing here is changes in cosmic radiation caused by the sun. So when the sun is very active, the amount of light that actually comes to the Earth, it doesn't change very much over time, less than 1%. But the amount of its magnetic activity and other wavelengths of the sun can vary much more. So when the sun spits out, has a coronal mass ejection, well, basically what the sun can do is push cosmic radiation away from the Earth, prevent cosmic radiation from striking us. So the event that you're seeing in purple here is called a four-bush decrease. It's a reduction in cosmic radiation reaching the Earth caused by the sun being very active. And what we see here is with one of these decreases, with the drop in cosmic radiation striking the Earth, the formation of clouds changes dramatically. Right? We see these things dropping. Aerosols, cloud water, actual clouds themselves. So we know that there's a link between cosmic radiation and the formation of clouds and rain. There have been studies that have been performed at CERN in Switzerland where man-made cosmic radiation produced by the synchrotron at CERN has been used in a chamber to mimic the atmosphere to create clouds by adding artificial cosmic radiation. Of a chart, well, I don't need to show a chart. if you have questions, we can talk more about that. But let me just say that. So the other aspect of this is long-term changes in the climate, because the change in clouds has a powerful effect on the climate. Sorry, here it is. Good. So here you see in red is the amount of cosmic radiation striking the Earth backwards. So when it goes up, it means there's less cosmic radiation. Blue is the temperature. And so this is over hundreds of millions of years. You can see the numbers on the bottom, which I know are hard to make out. So the hypothesis is that a major part of the changes in the Earth's climate, why do we have ice ages and warm periods? Why do we have wet periods and dry periods? That over a long scale, a major aspect of this is caused by cosmic radiation striking the Earth. Cosmic radiation makes clouds. How do clouds affect the climate? Well, clouds are very light. If you see a picture of the Earth from space, clouds are white and the Earth is dark. When there are more clouds, more of the sunlight bounces off of the Earth, is reflected, and that cools down the Earth. More cloud cover, cooler Earth. So the idea is a powerful sun pushes away cosmic radiation. There are less clouds and higher temperatures. So strong solar activity makes for warmer temperatures. And this is seen over, we only know about the sun's activity directly for a few hundred years since we've been observing sunspots. And the periods of having less sunspots, a less active sun, have been cooler in the climate. And the periods where you can't see that arrow. And the periods where, and then the periods where the sun's more active have been warmer. So currently the sun is declining in its activity, which would lead us to expect a cooler climate over the coming period. The role of all of this in the climate studies of the IPCC is basically ignored. They look at CO2 or the atmosphere, they have models that give results they want. They don't even really consider the impact of the sun's changing activity on the Earth, which means that you can throw out the idea that these are scientific reports. The global warming push is, although some researchers may not be part of this, overall it's part of a policy of destroying the economy and reducing the population. It's just made up. I don't care if you've heard that 97% of scientists agree with global warming. For one thing, it's not true. And the other thing is that's not how you know something. More than 97% of astronomers thought Copernicus was wrong. Who cares, right? Science isn't a popularity game. And expressing science in terms of popularity, I think, can show the weakness of that concept. So how do we use this knowledge? Let's get to the solution here. Oh, also the reason for it. The reason for these changes in cosmic radiation over these very long periods of time, over hundreds of millions of years, is hypothesized to be the sun moving through the Milky Way, moving through the galaxy between places where there are lots of stars. Let me get this picture. Moving through spots where it's very dense and parts where it's weaker. Strong, weaker. In the stronger parts where there's lots of stars clumped together, there's more cosmic radiation. And in the rarer parts, there would be less. So that's the reason given behind the observation of these things. So we can use this. We can do our own ionization. We can set up facilities that ionize the atmosphere with some high voltage wiring, some high voltage lines, and create the conditions to increase the amount of cloud cover, increase the amount of rainfall. And this has been studied. This has been done commercially in several nations, several places around the world. this chart, which I'll adjust the contrast. This is difficult to see, but the yeah, you can almost see it there. These are some. This is a basin in Mexico where, and you can see the amount of water in several reservoirs was flat, and then at the point that this atmospheric electrification project was initiated, the amount of rainfall increased, and the reservoirs were increasingly filled up. So this isn't a hypothetical kind of technology. Show you some of the other places this is used around the world. This is in red. You see the location of some of these stations in Mexico, and above the increase in water measured when the system was used. And it's been used all over the place: Australia, Oman, Golan Heights. Where's this chart? Here we go. UAE, Russia, Mexico, as I mentioned. So we have the ability to transform the way the atmosphere works. We have the ability to directly take seawater and remove the salt. And we have the ability to move water once it has fallen, as China's doing with the South Water North project, which is already moving water beyond the water projects of the southwestern US. And it's not even done. As it continues, it'll be twice that large, taking water from where there's a surplus to where there are droughts, making that water more productive, increasing the potential population, developing the economy, and continuing a general progress of increasing our power over nature. Now, human beings, we don't have a fixed relationship to nature. An animal species does. For butterflies, there are only so many butterflies that can live in a certain garden. Or squirrels, and there's only so many things for them to eat. They have predators, or used to. Now they live in parks and there's a ton of them. Rabbits. Any of these animals, there's a limit to how many can live in a certain area. For human beings, there is no limit that is determined by nature. There is a limit, but it's determined by us. Think about the development of agriculture. Before agriculture, the number of people that could live was much lower. Before Louis Pasteur and the germ theory of disease, the number of people that could live and lifespans was lower. Before the development of electricity and motors and all of this, the number of the potential of the potential population was lower. So in other words, we are able to transform that. And what we do in this regard is something that life does as a whole. Life develops increasing independence from its environment. Let's take a few steps on this, and then we'll wrap up, and I'd like to looking forward to the discussion. So let's compare evolution and human economy. Over evolutionary time, life has transformed so much. From the first life living in the crust of the earth or deep sea vents, the source of energy for life was chemical. It was in the earth, terrestrial. Today, if you go and find a vent at the bottom of the ocean, you might find worms and all sorts of creatures living in it that all depend on bacteria that use sulfur compounds coming out of that vent as their source of chemical energy. And from that, they were able to live. It's a very limited potential biomass on the entire planet. It all depends on chemicals in the crust of the earth or coming out through vents. Photosynthesis transformed that totally. Now the potential energy for life was not only chemicals, limited amounts of chemicals, An environmentalist bacterium might say, stop using the sulfur, we'll run out. Instead, a new resource is developed, light. The sun is providing lots of light. Now life could use it, beginning in the water, in the oceans. That transformed dramatically the potential population, the potential size of biomass. The creation of oxygen by photosynthesis was another crisis. Oxygen is poisonous. It's a toxin. As the amount of oxygen increased, organisms had to change to live in that high oxygen environment. And in fact, they developed the ability to use the oxygen through aerobic respiration. So new chemical cycles developed to use oxygen as part of the energy supply instead of it being a poison. That's a big transformation. How about another big step? Instead of individual cells living on their own, floating around, the creation of colonial life, of multicellular life, meant that the cells didn't interact directly with their environment anymore, but if they were a tissue surrounded by other cells, their environment was now created by that life. The inner cells were now more independent from their environment, more able to have specialized processes that need a special environment. They create it. How about moving on to land? Land is very dry. It's hard for a cell to live out on dry land, being baked by the sun in the daytime and then freezing at night. The move to land required new body forms to hold that water in, to create an internal environment, to bring the ocean with you. It required new reproductive strategies. Some of the oldest plants, evolutionarily, such as mosses or ferns, they require water for their reproduction. They release spores that actually have to mate in a wet environment. The breakthrough of forming seeds, where the fertilization occurs in the plant, which then creates a seed, which has the male and female gametes already combined, with a coating too, that was required for reproduction on land. So an independence from the environment, no more needing water surrounding you. You can keep it in yourself, you change the way you reproduce. Look at us, human beings. We don't depend on finding food around us. We make it. We have agriculture. You plant seeds, and then there is no mystery of where you will find food. You'll find it in your farm. With the development of the calendar, astronomy guiding us through the year, the ability to form agriculture and then have enough food to be able to form cities and lay the foundation then for poetry, for writing, for further astronomy, for science, for study. We've been able to transform our relationship to nature, where today most of our resources are not natural. They're not natural in the meaning that they do not already exist. Our food, we produce it. We have farming. We have agriculture. There are some wild, berries that are fine. There's some part of that, but for the most part, it's produced directly. We create our food. We don't find it. We don't hunt it. How about our resources? We don't live in a cave. This is one of the gifts of Prometheus. Aeschylus tells us that Prometheus taught early man how to build houses, so you can live somewhere besides in a cave. We create our shelters. We create the resources that we use. Coal, for example, for energy, developed in the 1800s in a massive way. Yeah, coal already exists in the earth, but it's not a resource in the same way before you discover how to use it to make a steam engine. Now, coal powers motion. This is it's a major breakthrough. Fire has existed for a long time to cook, to transform materials. Now fire can create motion. Amazing. Today, uranium is a resource. Deuterium, tritium, helium for fusion. this can become a resource. So by creating resources, we now have an independence that is much greater than individual forms of life from the environment. And we're responsible increasingly for developing our own environments, which you see most dramatically in space, where you have to bring everything with you. So the next stages for this, in terms of water, for example, would mean a massive program. Let's have desalination. It's not very expensive. We could build it reasonably quickly. It's cheap. Ionization. Let's set these systems up. Let's create more water. Let's pull more water out of the atmosphere, which then can change the patterns and bring more into it. Let's do that. Let's move water that has already fallen as needed to make it more productive. So let me conclude with the complaints that come up about this. You know, people say, I was talking with a businessman, and he says, well, the desalination, it makes the water with a bad pH. It doesn't taste good. Other people say, well, desalination, you make the ocean more salty. That's not good for life. Or with the projects to take water from the rivers that go into the Arctic and bring them down into the southwest parts of the continent, people say, well, that will change the salinity of the Arctic Ocean if there's less rivers. Now, here's the funny thing. For one thing, nature is not constant. Nature changes all the time. In California, we are not entering a drought right now. Rather, the last 100 years were exceptionally wet. Most probably, the drought that is coming now is more normal, and it could be expected to last for, who knows, centuries. So the idea that we have to maintain nature or preserve nature, say why? Well, we don't want to ruin our environment around us. Pollution is bad. Cleaning air pollution from trucks, for example, that's a major step. It's a step that we've done a good job in among the more developed nations. And today in China, for example, air pollution is a very serious problem. And it's very good that they're developing and hopefully enforcing more environmental controls on, truck emissions, power plants, construction sites. That's good. Yes, we should have air that is not unhealthy. Everybody agrees with this. We should not have water that is toxic, that you can actually, you can go for a swim and not get sick. That's good, of course. Yes, I think everybody agrees with this. But there is a religious dimension that goes beyond this, that says nature in its current state is inherently good. And that's different. Not killing you, that's definitely good. There is a measure there. Not getting sick from drinking water, that's a measure there. Not killing all the fish in it, that's a measure there. But what happens when you say that any change is inherently bad? Well, what makes nature so good right now? Like I said, 200 years ago, California was very dry. 50 years ago, much wetter than today. It changes. We have ice ages. It changes. Almost all of life that has ever existed on this planet has gone extinct, over 98%. It changes. So the idea that we have to bow to a god of nature and feel bad about changing anything, it's a religious belief. And it has lost its connection to objective human standards of what's a good environment to have around us. Deserts, for example, they don't produce very much life. We shouldn't eliminate every desert on Earth. It's good for biological study, but we've got a lot of them right now. We have no danger of running out. So we should feel free not to bow to Zeus, or his modern expression is Prince Philip, or the World Wildlife Foundation, or lunatics who are saying that carbon dioxide is a pollutant and we know all of the science about this, and also say we shouldn't have nuclear power. this isn't out of a concern for a good environment around us. This is oligarchy, pure and simple. To reduce living standards, to create a society that is easiest to control, and a financial system that makes that possible. So to break out from that, you know, we would do, for example, here in the US, we need to throw Obama out before we have a nuclear war with Russia. And that's that's what we're very close to. And we need to dump the transatlantic economic ideology that says that it's basically Adam Smith's system that says that money is the measure, and frankly, it exists as a tool of Wall Street, as a tool of thievery. And instead, adopt a physical economic approach where we say that measuring the well-being of people, our physical production, our ability to discover new technologies and implement them, that's the source of economic wealth, not the stock market. And the most powerful form of fire, the next stage in our development, will be doing the research, putting in the funding that's necessary, the thinking that's necessary to develop fusion power, and to use fission power now as the source of power that's able to supply enough to bring the world out of poverty and, for example, to be able to desalinate water as needed, to create materials as needed. So I think I'll stop with that, and I'd like to see what you think.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason.
Sure.
Okay, so do you have a bit of time to answer our questions? I'm
Sure.
sure people have a lot of questions. If people could just name themselves and yes, speak up or come speak in the mic here. If you have a question for Jason, just identify yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Jason. Is Ilko Dimov. We are talking about the atmospheric ionization, but the question of ionization, what kind of ion actually we are creating, this how the water molecule are clustering together, this was not developed in details. So the thing is, I'm presenting this to people without knowing the science behind it. Can you describe a little bit more in detail how the ionization of the air created the clusters and how this thing work? Or maybe you can send me an email later on if this.
Well, I think that we do have a lot of. First off, I refer in general everybody to the past few issues of EIR magazine, which have had a lot of extensive articles going through it, and also on the LaRouche-PAC site under our water page. There's an interview with a Russian professor, or Ukrainian, Sergei Pulinets, where he describes his work looking at earthquakes, ionization, weather transformation. And I think the shortest aspect of it is that when particles are charged, they have an ionic attraction towards each other. And that causes them to clump together more than uncharged particles do. I think that's part of the basis for some kinds of air filters, for example. I'm not sure what to say about what kind of, ionization. See, part of it is that these are companies trying to sell their product. So they're not writing papers where they describe everything about what voltage they use, for example. But these stations, let me show a picture of one of the stations. Yeah, so here you see a guy standing at one of these stations. It's a small thing. It uses only a few hundred watts, very little energy. And then these, maybe you can see the tower in the back here. The tower is just connected with wires, which basically just run at a high voltage. And, the electricity, the charge just comes right out of the wires and then ionizes the things around them. So, this is how many towers they had built in Mexico. So not so many. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, partly because I don't know and they don't release the exact parameters of, does it pulse? Is it strong currents that then turn back off? What's the voltage? They don't say because it's, you know, it's a company, it's an industrial secret kind of thing. They haven't patented it in the way that, you know, they'd reveal all of their information. So I'm afraid I don't know. I mean, I believe it's a positive charge, but that's about all I can say. I'm not even sure about that, so I guess yeah, that's my ignorance on the subject.
You asked a question, you mentioned the desalination could be done relatively quickly. Is that in terms of the months, years? Do we have the technology already?
Yeah, I think I heard, maybe I only heard the end part, but you're asking about desalination and it can be done relatively quickly. Is that because the technologies already exist and the funding?
Yes.
Did I hear that right? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a major breakthrough in the past couple of decades with membrane technologies. So if you went back 20 years ago, or even still today in countries with a lot of oil, they make fresh water by distillation. Where, if you're cooking pasta, the water boils into steam and then it condenses on your kitchen. That's the way that people used to make water. So if you look back at Kennedy administration estimates of desalination in California, they're very energy intense because that was the technology that existed. Today, there's a much better way of doing it. Instead of creating tons of energy to evaporate water and then condense it back to liquid, what is now done is reverse osmosis. So, and this is the thing that makes it so much cheaper now. So osmosis is when you have a membrane that only allows water to move through it. So if you have very salty water on one side and fresh water on the other, the water here feels crowded out by the water here is crowded. There's so much water, it comes over here where there is more salt and less water. So normal osmosis, water goes into the saltier side. The reason the technology is called reverse osmosis is because if you push salty water against this membrane, you force the fresh water to come through, but not the salt. And this is about, it's like 10 times more, 6, 8, 10, it depends on exactly what kinds of numbers you're looking at, but it's several times, 5 to 10 times more efficient than distillation, where you change the state of water into a gas and then back into a liquid. So the largest desalination plant in the world using this technology is either just been completed or almost completed in Israel. It's called the Sorek plant. If you'd like to look it up to learn more about it, SOREK. And so it uses reverse desalination. It's of such a size that, for example, Israel, they produce about 40% of their water from desalination currently. So they have a very good job of expertise in this. And the actual membranes are produced by, General Electric or Siemens or a lot of the big industrial firms. Anyway, at that cost of the Israeli plant, all of the plants needed for California could be built for $24 billion. At the higher cost of the plant that's currently being built in San Diego, which also uses reverse osmosis, all of the plants in California could be built for about $100 billion. So if you use an average value and you get a loan and you do it over 30 years, and you do the numbers that way, the annual cost for building the 20 desalination plants along the coast of California is about, and providing the electricity, is only about $2 or $3 billion. So per Californian, $100 a year. It's not cheap. It's not, free, but it's not that much. If you compare that to the amount that people's water bills are already increasing right now in an attempt to keep water consumption down and through the penalties and things like that. So, I mean, those numbers, it's a little bit rough. Sort of back of the envelope. Well, but some professors from, I forget which California university got the same number. So the numbers are pretty good. I think that the point to make with it is, yes, it's a good idea, but also, why hasn't it already happened? If it's so relatively inexpensive, why haven't these things been built yet? And that's where you get at this ideology. The ideology of we shouldn't change anything. Or when the governor said, well, California for centuries had a population of 300,000 or 400,000. That's saying, well, let's just go back to that and let's abandon the idea of improving the resource availability. So I hope that answers your question. We've got a new technology that's much better with reverse osmosis, and the capital cost is really not that high. And then the operational cost, as I said earlier, is about 50 watts of electricity per person. That's all you need to create all the domestic fresh water needed for coastal California. Pretty small amount of electricity. So to power all of those plants, you don't really need about 2 or 3 new power plants in the state to power the 20 desalination facilities.
Une autre question, mademoiselle? Vous avez une question? La neige? Did you hear the question? Oh, well, it wasn't.
No, it's too quiet. I couldn't hear.
There's a person asking if desalination to snow. If desalination technologies applies to snow as well.
Well, it applies to, I don't think it applies to, I mean, snow is already distilled water, so snow doesn't have salt in it. It does apply to, in other words, it wouldn't be necessary because as the water came out of the ocean, it leaves the salt behind, and when it falls as snow, it has no salt, unless it lands in, a salty area. One place it is used is also for groundwater. For example, in Texas, there are some communities where if you have a well, the water from the ground has some salt in it. It's not like the ocean, but it's too salty to use for agriculture or for drinking. And in that case, the desalination costs drop dramatically. So it's used, most of the plants, there are desalination plants in Texas, and they are desalinating groundwater from a well, which has a little bit of salt in it. And you can do that for only 1/4 the energy cost of desalinating ocean water, at least for that kind of water they have in Texas.
Hi, Jason.
Hello.
I'm just to maybe ask a different kind of question a bit. In terms of often, talk to people when we're talking about this whole economic crisis, the solutions and all that. And there's a tendency for people to, either they don't know or often more, I think, subjectively, they don't want to go there in terms of this question of depopulation and the evil that's behind, right? These kind of policies of preventing real economic or scientific development, which is really the basis of the economy. How do you deal with that, I guess, where often people will say, well, they don't understand this concept of evil. They say, why would somebody really want to kill this many people or control the population like that? And just psychologically, the idea that there's really a satanic intention, it's not for resources, it's not for any of these things. How do you approach that? What would you say?
Thanks. It's a difficult question. I mean, sometimes it comes up on its own. As I understand it, the question of how do you get across the concept that there actually is an evil intent for depopulation, for oligarchy. People wonder why would anyone be like that? It's very difficult to get into the mind of this kind of thinking because it's not corruption. It's not, it's not what you typically think about, the big banks or the big corporations, and they're trying to screw us to make money. Look, I don't know. I feel selfish sometimes. I'm sure I'm not the only person. But that selfishness taken to an extreme, that's not where oligarchy comes from. It's from a view that really people are animals, including the oligarchs themselves. I mean, people who have a view of mankind where they think that slavery is a tolerable concept, for example, what can their view of themselves be? You know, I mean, this comes up with the in the United States, for example. You know, people might wrongly believe that all of the founders of the United States owned slaves. It's not true. But those that did and really defended the practice they were the worst ones. I mean, this is people like Jefferson, who was he slept with his slaves for entertainment. He was a really terrible guy on economy. He was not any good. But anyway, the kind of person who could believe, yes, some people are just deserving of being slaves and to be treated like animals, they can't understand their own humanity either, if you allow yourself to think that way of others. So through a history, through a tradition, through a culture of oligarchism, I mean, you know, the British Empire was at its peak, you know, less than 100 years ago in terms of territory. I mean, even at the end of World War II, right? India was British. I mean, this was, you know, this is an immense thing. And the kind of outlook that's behind that doesn't just disappear. It looks different now. But when you have people like the Queen, like Prince Philip, say that the world population should be under 2 billion people, well, they said it. I mean, it can be difficult to get in their minds, but this isn't something that's some strange made-up hypothesis that these people believe this. They say it. You know, the Queen made a major push at Copenhagen. You know, she'd spoke to all the Commonwealth countries, and she said, we've really got to, at the Copenhagen Climate Conference some years ago, she said, this has got to be priority number one, global warming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a roundabout response, I think. Usually for me, when I'm talking to people, it often comes up on its own. That when you start tracing out, well, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? You just come to the conclusion, you know, there really is no explanation that's possible without the fact that there exists an evil intention among a faction of leadership in the world today that wants to deny that potential of the human species. LaRouche points to World War I. Well, to a lot of, take the concept of geopolitics overall, preventing other countries from developing. Look at the TPP, for example. You know, this secret agreement that puts governments, puts corporations above governments in terms of their legal ability to sue over lost profits, and as a political attack against China, against Russia. You want to have a Pacific partnership and leave out China? Crazy. And Russia too? You know, what's the intent in this? And it's a view of, hey, we got to prevent China from growing and developing. That's gross. What's bad about the growth of somebody else? Why does it have to be a competition? Is there one pie that we are all sharing? And so that's the danger today and the origin of the war threat with Russia. What's happening in Ukraine, for example? Why is Victoria Nuland from the State Department, why is she constantly over there in Ukraine? Why did she, you know, choose the government? Why is she so involved? Is it to defend the people of Ukraine from the evil Russians? No, they're being used. Ukraine's in terrible shape. The economy is collapsing. They've got Nazi parties, literally Nazi people who supported the Nazis in World War II and those parties and political movements in the government, you know, directing the security services. So this isn't like trying to help the people of Ukraine. It's basically saying, it's basically playing a game of chicken with Russia and saying, will Russia give in? Telling China, you're sorry, you can't grow. You know, Obama said, if we don't set the rules in the Pacific, China will. What's China doing that's so bad? Look at the development work that they're doing with Africa. They're the biggest investor now in infrastructure in Africa. That's great. So I'm not very satisfied with that response, but that's let me stop saying any more about it for now, or if you've got, or you can tell me what you think, or.
Thank you.
Sure.
D'autres questions?
Yeah, I have a question in terms of the evaporation. We're talking about evaporation for 90% of the water that has been evaporation goes back to the ocean, right? And you propose only one solution, which was ionization, right? Or
That, yeah, that's one of them.
yeah. Is there any other methods which seem more efficient than ionization, or is that the only solution?
Let me make sure I heard that right. You're asking regarding the water that's already evaporated and we want to get it to fall on land, are there other technologies besides ionization, or is that the
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I don't know of any other ones. I mean, I'm sure there are other people studying other technologies. One of them is physical cloud creation, and this we already do. I mean, China, for example, I believe spent over equivalent of $1 billion on weather modification using silver iodide mainly. So from airplanes that sprinkle it in the air, and then it causes the water vapor to condense. Or also, I think most of it was from mortars, or shooting up missiles from the ground that release the silver iodide up there. And so that's used already, and it's not. I forget what the numbers are. The Beijing Meteorology Office has a department of rain engineering already. So I'd say that's one major technology that does exist. They used it to keep the Olympics free of rain, to make sure they have good weather. You make it rain somewhere else so that the moisture cannot reach the Olympics. So they did this. They have used it to help control sandstorms. Much of China is very dry, and so sometimes sandstorms come to Beijing, and there have been a couple of times where they deliberately work to create rain to fall to get the dust out of the air. So, but the only two I'm aware of are the physical creation of clouds and the ionization. I think the ionization idea comes from the connection to the process that takes place with the cosmic radiation. So in other words, it's well understood why it's possible, but I don't know of any others, but who knows what else we may discover. But this is the one that is already well studied and has been used.
Wait.
Johan Gagnon speaking here. Jason, MIT just released within the last two weeks a new solar-based technology to desalinize ocean water, and it's more economical than reverse osmosis, and no easily done than reverse osmosis. I don't know if you heard of it. If not, I could send you an email to let you know about that release.
It's very quiet. I wasn't able to hear
The question was regarding an MIT study that they came up with a better way than reverse osmosis to desalinate water. And he was wondering if you knew about it. Otherwise, he could send you an email.
Oh, yeah. Please send an email. Email Jason Ross, JASONROSS .LPAC at Gmail. JasonRoss.LPAC at Gmail. Yeah, I haven't heard of this. Do you know what no?
Yeah, another question here.
I
and it's a totally different perspective. I was trying to, I'm kind of interested in the, I would say, alternative approach to economics, which was like mainly currently my own. So I'd like to introduce that into my own circle of academia. I'm doing a PhD here in Montreal. And I was faced by strong opposition from my professor and the department saying that this is not scientifically based. So they even described the whole theory and everything as op-eds. They said these are just op-eds, as if they were like, articles in journals. So what would be the rebuttal? How could you actually play from within the system to have academic approach to alternative economics?
Again, it's very quiet, so I couldn't hear the beginning of what
the question was from somebody here doing a PhD in economics.
Uh-huh.
And he faced certain opposition from his teachers when he was trying to explain to them LaRouche's economics.
Mm-hmm.
That what they were saying is that this was op-ed, so it was like just theories, pretty much. So the person was asking what would be the rebuttal for these
Okay.
teachers.
Well, I'd say look.
If you have a scientific model that's proven and published in some academic journal, great. Okay.
Yeah.
There's nothing. Just send it out as they're not.
Yeah. So the teacher was asked. So the teacher was asking, you have a model, you have a published paper in some kind of scientific journal that demonstrate LaRouche's economics. Otherwise, what do you do?
Yeah, well, LaRouche has been publishing quite a bit. I mean, he founded a news magazine decades ago called EIR, which in the 80s at least produced quarterly economic forecasts with very specific numbers for different fields of the economy. Part of what made it more difficult more recently was a change in the way that economic activity is reported, and the modeling. So he hasn't done any modeling more recently. I think the change was made in the 90s. Anyway, but that's very specific. In broad strokes, I mean, what LaRouche points to very specifically are his forecast of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which occurred in 1971. His forecast of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he had made in 1983. He said in about 5 years, if this isn't addressed, the Soviet Union will collapse, and it did. And then more recently, the collapse of the dot-coms, for example. I remember that. I was in college at the time, and I had gone to an economics professor and a computer professor, and I said, hey, I'm reading this man LaRouche. He says that the dot-coms are, it's a bubble. This isn't really a basis of economy because it has to be physical. And they said, oh, you're crazy. Forget it. We have a new economy. There will be no more recessions. So, and then we know what happened. So that was, that definitely made it clear to me that, hey, you know what? This guy was right, and these economists were just so wrong. But look at the economy today. I mean, it's being directed by economics professors, not as academics, is another important thing. And it's failing. Look at the transatlantic sector. It's failing. So I think one thing to point to today is the difference in approaches between, the way the World Bank operates, or the transatlantic economies, the EU. The EU is doing great, right? Right? Look at that economy. Compare that with what the BRICS nations are doing. There's a different approach between those two theories. And I think any professor can recognize that. Say, hey, the approach of the World Bank, the EU, is different from the approach of the BRICS, of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, of the New Development Bank, of the BRICS nations. So we see right now in practice two different theories of approaching economics. And the difference is dramatic and startling. So I think that's one big thing. This new Silk Road, this paradigm that's being adopted by the BRICS, LaRouche and his wife have been promoting this for decades now. And his wife in particular is quite well known in China. as having promoted this since the 80s. So it's already happening, is one way of looking at it. Say, which of these economic systems should we be following? What are we doing to ourselves right now? What are we, if we refuse to take on the control of the banking system, if we refuse to put in place that's something to ask a professor. What do you think about Glass-Steagall? Or I'm not sure about Canadian financial regulation and how investment versus commercial banks are regulated there, but in the United States, it'd be one thing, say, well, do you think that we should be guaranteeing banks that engage in investment activity with your commercial holdings and then get insured? Should that happen? Right? So those are some of the questions I would think of asking. I want to say one more thing. In LaRouche's economics textbook, he says, look, most economic theory, it's not economic theory, it's political theory. It's the economic implications of a political theory. The implications of a political theory, right? So if you contrast Adam Smith with Leibniz, if you contrast other British free trade thinkers with Alexander Hamilton, say, well, one outlook was developed by an empire. Policies to defend, promote an empire. A different type of policy was set up by Alexander Hamilton, who, you know, had a different approach to banking and to credit. But he also had an approach of saying, hey, we've got to become a manufacturing society. We've got to develop new technologies. That's the source of wealth. That was Alexander Hamilton's viewpoint. So do people today adopt the viewpoint of Alexander Hamilton? You know, I don't think so. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is that in part, what LaRouche is saying is not new. In part it is, but in large part, his viewpoint is what the BRICS nations are doing now. It's what Alexander Hamilton did. It's what Abraham Lincoln did. So the other aspect of it, the new aspect of it, I would say is best understood by judging it on its merits. And as far as the empirical verification, he's made a number of economic forecasts. The academic community as a whole has been so wrong, so repeatedly, especially over the past decades, so wrong, so repeatedly that you know, it's hard for them to justify themselves, I think. I hope that's helpful.
Another question here.
This is Evan Figuera. Concerning the ionization, the process and such, could we be looking at more of a control or less control, more potential for things like superstorms and hurricanes coming off the coast, since we're bringing in more water?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, obviously, it's something that would have to be really, you know, this has got to be, I mean, if everybody starts doing this and like, you know, you say, hey, I want it wet, I'm a farmer, and then over here say, hey, we're a retirement community, we want it dry, and you've got competing ionization systems. I mean, obviously, it's got to be done from the top down, from a regional, you know, national or really international perspective, because you're impacting, you know, weather patterns, which are international. And I think that would include, you know, the potential to affect weather in a way that strengthens or in a way that weakens and mitigates the effects of extreme weather, like a hurricane or maybe a tornado. I know that research work on that has been performed. I don't know what to say about, I mean, we would have to do studies specifically aimed at that kind of you know, at trying to see, can those things be influenced, etc. Because it is, it's in a similar process. The condensation of water vapor turning into like a cloud, condensing, releases quite a bit of heat. Like when you put pot of water on the stove and you turn the heater on, it takes a certain amount of time and now it is boiling. If you want to wait for all of the water to boil, it takes a longer time. It takes much longer. A lot of energy in the state change from gas to liquid for water. So to what effect does this contribute or transform hurricanes, which are based on these pressure differences and heat differences? You know, I don't really know, but I think that you're right in, hey, this is a real field that we should study and look at and make sure that we understand all the aspects of this, including other potential applications, such as, hey, could these be out in the Atlantic to modify and prevent hurricanes? I don't know. It needs more study, but it's a fascinating field that we haven't really done enough work with.
We'll pass it, Laurent. Another question here? Okay, Laurent.
Bonjour Jason, mon nom est Laurent Gagné. My name is Laurent Gagné. I want to make a comment on all what has been said in your communication. We have to be aware that the society in which we live in the West, society has been taken over by what I call Rothschild Khazarian mafia. As long as we are living in that system, all you are alluding to, we are not able to go farther. We won't be able to use all the concepts and all the technology we have around because the Rothschild Khazarian mafia just does not want the people to use these technologies for a living society. There is a confrontation between Rothschild Khazarian mafia and the BRICS. The philosophy of both systems is different. We see that, but the confrontation is not over. As long as we are in a confrontation with the Rothschild Khazarian mafia, we are going nowhere. Thanks.
Oh, it's absolutely true. And that's why you can't have a political fight that is based on issues, on politics, policies. You say, well, we want this policy. It's a good policy. Support this. Maybe you are right, but sometimes the reason for the absence of a good policy is not a lack of knowledge, right? It's, as you put it, this Rachel Carson mafia type attack against good policies. That's why I started with this Prometheus Zeus difference, that the reason we have bad policies, it's not a mistake. Why do we have poverty in the world right now? It's not a mistake. Why do we have hunger? We know how to grow food. This is not a mystery, but we understand this very well. And since the development of the green revolution, the real green revolution, and fertilizer and the changes of the 20th century, there is no excuse for hunger in this world. If it continues to exist, it is because it is intentional hunger, intentional poverty. So this is why, for example, Lyndon LaRouche warns and attacks constantly against being practical, being pragmatic. When you try to say this is a good policy and I will talk only about it, you won't win anyway, because like you say, there is a grouping, there is a fight to stop these policies in principle. So that's why you can only win Today, we can only win the big fight. We need to work together to win the big fight, because that's the one where we can sweep away the origin of these environmental policies that say don't build anything ever. Mankind is evil. The policies that create the potential for war between NATO and Russia. Incredibly dangerous, suicidal. So yeah, it has to come, I agree, it has to come from the top down. And that means, I think, much like the earlier discussion about depopulation, does evil really exist? Is there an oligarchy? That we have to be willing to study that seriously, be open to discovering, yeah, there is an oligarchical principle. There is an intent to keep humanity backwards. And if you are not willing to discover that, if you are not willing to discuss that with somebody else, and you think, no, I should keep it focused on this specific topic, you can't win. So, like, I was speaking with a scientist in Alberta who, he's a space scientist, and he was, he tries to talk to his colleagues about global warming. He tries to go through with them why the theory doesn't make sense, etc. And it doesn't work. And it's, and as we were talking, it's like, well, the reason that they believe in this isn't scientific. So scientific argument cannot change somebody's mind if their reason for believing something is not scientific. So that's the importance of getting to the origins of why do people think about things the way that they do, and be willing to address that. And that often means going beyond the specific policies or issues.
Oui.
Yes, well, we were talking about remedies for lack of water. We're talking about remedies for lack of water. I was wondering if any thought we considered, like, snow, like, is it possible to clean it, to put it into bottles, is somebody doing that?
Could you repeat it? It was quiet. Could you repeat? I couldn't hear.
Yeah, can you hear? Okay. Yeah, it's the same person asking about snow, because she's saying that we're talking about increasing the amount of water available for consumption, and if anybody or any company has looked into using snow as one of the source to increase that amount of water, bottling it or whatever.
No, not that I know of, not directly. I mean, snow's got a lot of air in it. I'm just thinking about it right now. Snow's got a lot of air in it, so I mean, I suppose you could try to, if you could warm. Well, I mean, with snow, there's an annual snow cycle also, where the snowfall, like in California, for example, snow falls in the mountains. And then as the weather heats up in spring and into summer, the snow melts. And this is the source of the water during the time of year where it is very helpful. So it's good that it stays as snow as a means of storage. In very cold places, the snow stays. And you say, well, is it doing anybody any good up there? Maybe you'd say, could we melt it and cause it to flow into the rivers? But my belief, I think that regions that have very much snow also have already a very good supply of water through the rivers. So I don't know what beneficial effect would come from causing more of the snow to melt. And I just think it's a lot easier to move water when it's already a liquid. So that's why, for example, in the northwest of the continent, there's plenty of snow, there's plenty of water, And the question would be, can we transport that water to where it is needed? And the most efficient way of moving water is in canals or is in pipes and this sort of thing, which requires that it be a liquid.
I know, for example, that in the 1930s, like in the Canadian prairie provinces, that's one of the things they would do. They would dig a dugout for snow when snow would fall. But I think that the difference today is that because of the size of the farms, so you would need some huge dugout, probably which is not worth doing. And instead, the next step is water transfer, taking that snow melting from rivers and then diverting the river instead of having this bigger and bigger dugout to collect the snow from falling.
It would be like a reservoir that was meant to hold the snow, so when it melts, you have the water.
Yeah, but that was at a time where, like, the small farms were very small, and they were really trying everything they could to prevent desertification. So they had a huge project throughout the country to build those dugouts.
Oh, huh, interesting. Yeah.
So, okay, one more question, and then we're gonna. Okay, it's a comment.
Bottling the snow, we typically are doing it is we buy bottled spring water. Spring water is melted snow, and it's cheaper to do it when it's in the water form liquid than it is to do it as snow.
Okay. Okay, one more question, then we're going to close.
About the physical economy that Briggs is trying to create, and I just wanted, it's possible to give us a briefing, a short briefing about that economy and compare it to the transatlantic and European economy that already exists.
So the question was about the BRICS and physical economy, and the person was asking if you could give an example of what the BRICS is doing compared to the transatlantic. A briefing, yeah, short, like yeah, the essence of both systems, the BRICS versus the transatlantic system.
Sure. Let me give two examples. Talk about financing and then talk about physical things. So on finance, a very good contrast is between the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the transatlantic financial institutions. There is a book by, I forget his first name, Perkins, Jeremy Perkins, or I forget. He wrote
John Perkins.
John Perkins, yeah. He wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And he talked about how loans were used as a form of political control over developing nations that needed money, where the purpose of giving a loan would actually be to force conditionalities on the country. What are conditionalities? The IMF would say, or the World Bank will say, let's say the World Bank, they say, okay, Guatemala, we will give you a loan to build this dam or this roadway system or rail line or whatever it might be. But we are concerned about your ability to pay it back because your economic policies are not healthy. So we will give you a loan if you raise the price of electricity and gasoline. Currently, you subsidize these things. That's a bad idea. If you eliminate those subsidies, then yes, we will give you a loan. So they get the loan, but the point in the loan is to control, to determine what the overall economic policy is of that country. And in this book, John Perkins describes how this was used to force people into loans and force people into adopting policies that would then allow control of their country, economic control, by large cartels that would then be able to, for example, one of the major conditionalities was privatization. They'll say, well, your economy is too regulated. You should allow private companies to own your water companies. And then, boom, who comes in? Of course, it is not a domestic company. It's a large company headquartered in, London or Luxembourg or something that then buys the country's water utility. So comparing that with the AIIB, which is devoted specifically for infrastructure, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, they've said conditionalities will not be a part of any of the loans that we give. We'll give a loan to build a project. We're not going to force policies on countries. We're not going to do that. So that's a major difference in outlook, where the bank really is going to have the purpose of physical investment and building things like the new Silk Road, which they're also setting up another fund specifically for Silk Road projects to pay for roads and bridges and tunnels and rail lines and water systems and electricity and fiber optics and everything that's needed for the foundation, the platform for economic growth. So then on the physical side, I think if you compare what's one of the best examples of this? How about manufacturing? Let's look at the past few decades. What's happened to manufacturing as a part of the economy in our nations? It's dropped very dramatically. What's happened in China? Now, at first, China got a lot of work because it was inexpensive. It got a lot of cheap work. And, China said, this is how we're going to get ourselves started. LaRouche told them, he said, no, that's a bad policy. You have to invest in your nation and not be a cheap labor market, which now is happening, where China is increasingly not only manufacturing a huge amount of the world's goods, but developing more of the ability to create and engineer the systems themselves at first. So, the way you see, what are some, I wish I had some better specific examples. Things coming to mind are things like, Argentina and Russia signing deals on space development. Oh, Russia and Iran signing deals on nuclear development. Russia, Rosatom is making large profits by working with nations to help build nuclear power plants there because, Russia still builds them. So, that's an actively good development. I'm afraid I'm a little bit tongue-tied right now. I would point people towards a video that Helga Sepp-LaRouche just made that's on the LaRouche PAC site. It's a 5-minute video. Goes through the Silk Road. And we've got a whole very good video that goes through the World Land Bridge and the new Silk Road as a concept. And I think that would provide a lot of good specifics for you. I'm feeling kind of forgetful right now. Sorry.
Dernier commentaire.
Jason, Laurent Gagné speaking here.
Hello.
I will add a few comments on the previous intervenant. In the West, we live in the society in the West is the Rothschild-Khazarian mafia control. In this system, in the dollar system, US dollar system, every money is based on the debt emitted by the Rothschild-Khazarian mafia. In the BRICS, money is emitted on the productive capacity of those nations, and the money emitted is controlled by the Treasury Department of those nations. Either we live in a system where money is emitted on the productivity of the nation, or we live in a system where debt is emitted, money is emitted as debt. Those are two philosophical different systems. We have to be aware of that. Thanks.
Sure. I realized I had misheard you before. You're saying the Rothschilds. I mistakenly heard before Rachel Carson, which there's also a Rachel Carson mafia. Look, yeah, on the there's definitely different approaches to money creation, and there's different approaches to finance. I'd like to say something short about Alexander Hamilton, because he created an institution. So after the revolution, the United States had lots of debt. The individual states had lots of debt. And Alexander Hamilton very brilliantly turned that debt into a benefit. He had, by making sure that the debt interest payments could be made and were absolutely guaranteed, the value of certificates of that debt increased. People were happy to own that debt because they said, okay, I will get interest payments, etc. And then by creating a national bank in which those debt certificates were accepted as collateral, that bank could then create money on the basis of the public debt and have a very stable and increased money supply where it was not tied to gold and silver. I mean, there are some crazy thoughts that money should be based on this metal. Now, yeah, gold has an industrial value. It does have a certain cost of production. But the idea that, in the 21st century, we should base money, in a very large and important aspect of economy on a metal, it's a little bit silly. That's more than a little bit silly. It's very silly. So, yeah, Hamilton made this bank, but the important aspect of it was what the mission of the country was. See, it's again this concept of you have to go to the biggest and greatest of issues. That financial or monetary policy is important, but you can't create a future only by adjusting and controlling and laying out principles for monetary policy. You have to have specific goals. So things like developing water systems, we need so much infrastructure to be built around the nation now. It's, there's a huge deficit in physical infrastructure. To do the research, to develop fusion, to try different branches of research on this. You have to have a mission, a physical mission for the nation. Otherwise, money and monetary policy by itself, although it is important to have a good one, does not by itself guarantee a thriving economy. And so in the functioning of the national banks of the United States, it was a good concept as Hamilton had developed it, but without leadership and guidance of a direction of what should the next breakthrough be, where should we go, the structure itself wasn't good.
Thank you, Jason. We're going to come to a close here.
Okay.
So thanks a lot for the presentation and your time. Very appreciate it.
It's fun. Maybe you can send me maybe you guys can take a group selfie and send me a picture. I'd like to see who I've been talking to.
All right. Okay.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.